They won't go away because if we still want to have electricity and we want to have transportation, we really don't have other options at this point. The technology just isn't there for us to rely on renewables to supply the kind of energy needs that our modern life requires.
How much, Ellen, can the big oil giants, can the big energy players really play a leading role, considering that the transition fundamentally threatens their business model?
The transition fundamentally threatens their business model, except that the transition still relies on fossil fuels. In fact, one of the most interesting things that came out of this report, which I think in some respects is not so useful, but in other respects can be useful, is that we're just under-investing in energy all over the place. There's not enough investment in fossil fuels. There's not enough investment in renewables. There's not enough investment in other forms of energy like nuclear and other things in order to meet our growing demand. So energy companies, big legacy energy companies, definitely play a role. They play a major role in research. They have incredible resources to be able to research new ways to and breakthroughs in energy. And it's just as likely that we could see a breakthrough in clean energy technology from a company like Exxon than we could from a startup from Silicon Valley.
The question is,
I wouldn't count those out, but
the question is, where should this money, I don't mean to interrupt, but where the money comes from, right? Should it come from the public sector or should it come from the private sector? And I do wonder, as we see the price of oil climb to the degree that it has, does this actually expedite the transition to greener technologies and, frankly, the investment there from a market perspective, as long as that oil price is allowed to rise?
Absolutely. That's a really, really good question. I think the answer is if you really do want to have an effective energy transition, you need to have money coming from both the private sector and the public sector. The public sector can be really, really helpful in things like infrastructure development, planning, those kinds of things, some types of incentives. But at the same time, we do need to see money from the private sector. And yes, higher oil prices can lead to more investment. This is a cycle that we see over and over. We saw it in the 80s when oil prices became very high in the 70s, but a lot of that money oil companies put into developing more resources. And we know today that especially the big energy companies will put resources into natural gas and other types of renewables or clean energy technologies. So it's not like that money is just going into building more oil fields and mining more coal. The question really is, when are we going to see more of that? Because right now, we're not seeing that investment being put in. We're seeing money mostly being returned to shareholders.
Alan Wald, I'm going to lean on Mark Maslin here, one of the giants of climate change analysis. And folks, this is wicked nerdy, wicked science discussion. And the bottom line is we drift from Davos to Davos, COP to COP, and we're trying to get something done. And what Maslin and many others say, at the margin, it's about the big players. Who's the big player that has to get their act together?
China, without a doubt. At this point, China is manufacturing a lot of the world's steel and a lot of other really important products, and it's doing it in the absolute dirtiest way. And if you want to look at global emissions, if we're looking at climate change and emissions on a global scale, then China is the big emitter. Yes, Western countries definitely emit more per capita, but with the way that we rely on China for so many of the key goods that we consume, we have to address China's methods of production.
Ellen, how optimistic are you that we're not going to lose this fight?
I'm generally pretty optimistic, and I think that we're not going to lose the fight. We're not going to, see catastrophe happen, in the next 10 or 20 years or in the future. I do think that humanity is very resilient, and also that we will develop new technologies. These new technologies will come. The problem is that they're not here yet. But I do believe in the ingenuity of the human race and the human mind, that we will develop better clean energy technologies that can support our growing energy needs.
So what's the goal out of Glasgow? What's the goal to make Dr. Wald happy with the COP26 meetings? What needs to get done?
what I would really like to see is an acceptance and an acknowledgement of the reality of the energy situation. And I think that that's really risen to the forefront now that we're seeing much higher energy prices in Europe and Asia, the potential for even to experience brownouts and blackouts, or to have to really cut back on consumption over the winter. So I'd like to see a recognition that this is the reality of the situation that we're in, and we need to make a decision. Do we want to cut back on our power consumption? Do we want to say, look, we may not be able to supply continuous electricity to everyone in the developing world, or in the developed world, if we want to, pursue these ambitious, clean and renewable energy goals. But at the same time, I'd also like to see an acknowledgement of what's going on in the developing world and the energy poverty there, and the need to really bring energy and electricity to these people.
Ellen, nobody cares. All we want to know is when we get a new edition of Saudi Ink out. When are you going to put out a new book?
We'll see about that. It's definitely coming.
It's definitely coming and is a moving target. Ellen Wald, truly definitive on Saudi Arabia and the royal family at the Atlantic Council, and their senior fellow as well. Lisa, I was at